It's always the big debate at championship courses. Should there be hills? Should it be flat? You know, what should we do? People want flat courses because they want them to go fast, but coaches sometimes like the hilly courses because they serve certain athletes better than others, and frankly, having a challenge is always a little bit fun. I'm Jesse Funk, and on today's episode of Runner's High, I'm going to talk to you about a few calculations people smarter than me have figured out about how hills affect our running speed. If you've been with me here on the channel for any period of time, you know that recently I flew out to Colorado Springs to run the Incline. It's actually Manitou Springs. It is a trail run, a little less than a mile, and it climbs 2,000 feet in that time. Because I had no idea of what the implications of that kind of run would be. I'd never run anything of that magnitude. I started to pore over the numbers. If you haven't seen that video, hit that subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner and go check that out after this video. But I started to try to figure out, you know, how is this climb going to affect my speed? What is it going to do to me? And I found a couple calculations that actually pertain to the gradient change and our base speed and how that affects how fast we're going to go. What I came up with were two very different approaches to this problem of figuring out how that hill gradient change changes our running time. These are by two coaches, our beloved communal running coach Jack Daniels, who I often refer to, and also Coach John Kellogg, who you might know from the Let's Run Forum. Daniels' formula takes into account an uphill and downhill change and does them differently. He says for every percent grade change uphill, we're going to lose 12 to 15 seconds. Every percent change downhill, we're going to gain back around 8 seconds. This is nice because we know going uphill, we're going to lose more time than when we go downhill. Just like when we're in a headwind versus a tailwind, we lose more time in a headwind than we gain in a tailwind. More particular to cycling, but it also has a little bit of play in running. Kellogg, on the other hand, doesn't take into account the up or down. He gives us more of a rule of thumb and says for every 10 feet of elevation change, regardless of direction, we change our speed basically by 1.74 seconds. Now, as a rule of thumb, I would actually probably say let's do 2 seconds so it's easier mental math, and then we can adjust from there. It's going to get you pretty close within a margin of error most of the time. But that's, you know, if you're looking at a course map, that's kind of the quick way to do it. Say the course map says so many feet, then you know you can multiply by 2 and figure out what your change in time is. Personally, as kind of a math nerd, I prefer Daniel's formula because it's a little bit more precise in that it counts for both uphill and downhill separately. But I can't help but love Kellogg's simplicity if we change it to that 2 seconds because of how easy it is. So say we have 100 feet of climbing. Well, then we have to divide that by 10. It's going to be 10 times 2, that's 20 seconds. And actually what you end up doing is because it's 1.74 instead of 2, we can take off roughly 10%, which makes it 18 seconds in change. When the actual answer here is 17.4 seconds. But multiplying by 2 is much, much simpler than multiplying by 1.74, especially when we have not nice numbers. I believe these formulas are very, very useful for most courses we're going to run into. But they do have a limit. And that limit comes into play on something like the Incline, where they don't really apply very well. So let's use Joe Gray as an example. Joe Gray is the kind of uncontested fastest known time on the Incline. His time was 17:45. Now, let's also know that his fastest 5K time, at least that I could find, is 14:12. Now, you may be thinking, okay, the Incline is just about a mile long, so shouldn't we use his mile time as our base? Well, I'm using a little bit of intuition here in saying that the Incline effort is roughly the same length time-wise as a 5K, so I want to use Joe's 5K mile time, mile split as it is, as our base time instead of using his fastest mile time and then making adjustments because, say Joe can run low 4s. Well, he can't hold up that kind of effort for 17 minutes in his particular case, so it doesn't really make sense to use a mile time. So we're gonna use that base time from his 5K and then make the adjustments using Daniel's formula and see what we get. The relevant numbers for us here, the incline is 0.88 miles. Now, because we're trying to use some calculation, I always like to try to build in wiggle room. So let's just assume that the incline is a full mile long. That way we can kind of try to account for the change in altitude. It climbs 2,000 feet. It starts at 6,500 feet, goes up to 8,500 feet. I have a whole other video on altitude change and how that affects us. So if you haven't seen that, as always, subscribe to the channel, but we have to take that into account. So let's pretend it's a mile long. The average gradient change is 43%. So that's going to come into our calculation, taking that 43 by Daniel's rule of 12 to 15 seconds. And the average mile split in Joe's 5K time is 4:38. So if we take, let's say, 15 seconds instead of 12, again, I like to try to give a little bit of wiggle room, and we know that the incline is a very, very difficult run. 15 seconds times 43, we end up with an additional 10 minutes and 45 seconds. We add that onto Joe's base time, and we end up with 15:23. As you can see, this calculation has its limits. Joe ran it in 17:45, nearly 2.5 minutes slower than what his supposed fastest time could be. 2.5 minutes is a lot, especially at that kind of range. It's like saying that he runs a 17:45 5K and he can take 2.5 minutes off just through perseverance. I think maybe Joe has a faster time in him, but 2.5 minutes is a bit of a stretch. So this is a good example of how this calculation has limits. Even Daniel's version has limits. So any kind of course where you're going to have up to, say, 10% gradient change, and this is kind of just a guess and intuition based on my experience, these formulas are going to be a pretty good, reliable indicator of how your speed will change over the course based on those gradient changes. But anytime you get into something more extreme, like the incline, then it's going to be much more difficult to predict the actual outcome, because you get to a point where you can't actually run anymore. It is more walking and using your hands to scramble at some points because that trail is so extreme. As always, that button right there, or maybe it's right there, can get my backwards video together. Hit that subscribe button, stick around with me for more tips on running faster, running better, being the best runner you can possibly be. I'll see you next time on the next episode of Runner's High.